The morning air over England hung heavy with fog on October 4, 1943, as mechanics at RAF Halesworth fueled 52 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts for a deep penetration mission into Germany. Colonel Hubert Zemke stood watching them work, his breath visible in the cold dawn air. 29 years old, 6 months of combat experience, 4 confirmed kills to his name. He knew what waited for them over the continent. The Luftwaffe would send everything they had to protect the industrial targets his bombers would hit that morning. Intelligence estimated 180 Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were positioned to intercept. Every pilot climbing into those cockpits understood the mathematics of aerial combat, and the mathematics were brutally simple. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons empty. The German Focke-Wulf 190 weighed less than 4 tons. In a turning fight, physics was the ultimate arbiter, and physics favored the lighter aircraft. A lighter fighter could turn tighter circles. A heavier fighter died. There was no arguing with Newton's laws. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had lost 11 aircraft in their first 4 months of combat operations. 4 pilots killed, 7 captured. The Germans had a nickname for the Thunderbolt. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a flying tank that couldn't dogfight worth a damn. American bomber crews watched P-47s try to protect them and saw the truth play out in the skies above Europe every single day. When Focke-Wulfs attacked, the Thunderbolts couldn't stay with them through the turns. They tried. God knows they tried. But the simple reality of mass and momentum meant that when a German pilot threw his stick hard over and pulled into a tight spiral, the P-47 pilot who followed was left wallowing through the turn, bleeding energy, watching the enemy fighter pull away and come around behind him. Luftwaffe pilots had learned this lesson quickly and exploited it ruthlessly. They would break away from bomber formations, execute vertical maneuvers, and the heavy American fighters wouldn't follow because they couldn't follow. The physics wouldn't allow it. The summer of 1943 had provided painful proof. On June 26th, Zemke's group engaged Jagdgeschwader 26 over France. These were veteran German pilots, men who had fought over Britain, Russia, and North Africa. They flew circles around the P-47s, literally. 5 Thunderbolts went down that day. 4 American pilots died. Captain Robert Johnson barely made it home with his aircraft shot to pieces. Over 200 cannon and machine gun hits punched through his fighter. His Thunderbolt had taken punishment that would have obliterated any other aircraft and still flew. But it hadn't won the fight. It had merely survived it. The mathematics were inescapable. At 15,000 feet, a Focke-Wulf 190 could complete a 360-degree turn in 22 seconds. The Thunderbolt needed 28.6 seconds. 6 seconds might not sound like much in ordinary life. 6 seconds is barely enough time to tie your shoes or take a sip of coffee. But in aerial combat, 6 seconds was an eternity. 6 seconds was the difference between life and death, between going home and going down. In those 6 seconds, an enemy pilot could line up his guns, track his target, and fire the burst that ended everything. 8th Air Force generals watched their fighter group struggle and made plans accordingly. The new P-51 Mustang was coming online, lighter, faster in level flight, with better range than the P-47 could ever hope to achieve. The Thunderbolt program was beginning to look like a failed experiment, an aircraft designed by committee that tried to do everything and ended up doing nothing particularly well. 5 other fighter groups were scheduled to transition to Mustangs by the end of 1943. The writing was on the wall for the P-47. But Zemke had spent 2 years testing the P-47 before America entered the war. He knew something the Germans didn't know. He knew something that most American pilots didn't fully understand yet. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn. That much was undeniably true. But the Thunderbolt could dive, and in a dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe's inventory could match it. The birth of a flying tank. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt emerged from a design philosophy that prioritized survivability and firepower over agility. Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer at Republic Aviation, had built an aircraft around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. This was an 18-cylinder radial power plant that generated 2,000 horsepower at standard settings and could push even higher with water injection. The engine alone weighed over a ton. Wrapped around it was an airframe built like a fortress. The P-47's designers gave it self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits and keep flying. They added armor plating to protect the pilot from every conceivable angle. The cockpit featured thick bulletproof glass and steel plates that could stop 20mm cannon shells. Behind the pilot sat a massive turbocharger, essential for maintaining power at high altitudes, but adding hundreds of pounds to the aircraft's weight. The wing was thick and sturdy, designed to mount 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition. Every design choice added weight. Every safety feature, every armor plate, every structural reinforcement pushed the aircraft further from the lightweight fighters that dominated aerial combat. Thinking in 1943. The first prototype flew in May 1941, and Republic engineers immediately recognized they had created something unprecedented. This was the largest single-engine fighter ever built. At maximum takeoff weight with full fuel and ammunition, the P-47 could exceed 17,000 pounds. That was more than twice the weight of a Spitfire. It was substantially heavier than some twin-engine fighters. The production models that began rolling off the assembly line in 1942 inherited all these characteristics. They were massive, powerful, and according to conventional wisdom, fundamentally unsuited for air-to-air combat. Early test pilots compared flying the P-47 to piloting a bathtub around the sky. It climbed slowly. It accelerated reluctantly. The controls felt heavy and sluggish compared to the nimble fighters pilots had trained on. When the 56th Fighter Group received their first Thunderbolts in June 1942, the reactions ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. These men had joined the Army Air Forces to fly fighters, to engage in the romantic notion of aerial dueling, to prove themselves in single combat against enemy pilots. The P-47 seemed to promise none of those things. Don Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group, famously remarked when his unit transitioned to P-47s, "It ought to be able to dive. It certainly can't climb." His prejudices filtered down through his entire group. The 4th Fighter Group would eventually transition to P-51 Mustangs as soon as possible and would record the fewest kills of any of the initial P-47 groups in Europe. They never learned to love the Thunderbolt because they never stopped comparing it to the fighters they wanted to fly instead. But within that massive airframe and overwhelming weight lay capabilities that only became apparent when someone stopped trying to make the P-47 into something it wasn't and started exploring what it actually could do. The thick wing remained stable at speeds that would tear apart lighter aircraft. The massive engine kept producing power even as the air thinned at altitude. The robust structure could handle gravitational forces that would cause other fighters to come apart in midair. These weren't weaknesses. They were the foundation for an entirely new approach to aerial combat. But first, someone had to recognize them as strengths and figure out how to exploit them. Early disasters over Europe. The 56th Fighter Group arrived in England in January 1943, pilots without their aircraft, shivering in the English winter and impatient to get into combat. When their P-47s finally arrived 2 weeks later, the ground crews immediately discovered problems. The radios didn't work properly. The electrical systems were temperamental. British radio frequencies didn't match American equipment specifications. Mechanics worked around the clock to retrofit every aircraft with British radios and troubleshoot the myriad technical issues that plagued the early production Thunderbolts. The group's combat debut came on April 13, 1943, a fighter sweep over St. Omer. The Luftwaffe ignored them. Several more sweeps followed over the next few days, all uneventful. The Germans seemed content to let the big American fighters fly their patterns without engaging. Then, on April 15th, Major Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group scored the P-47's first kill, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 near Dieppe. 2 weeks later, disaster struck the 56th. On April 29th, the group encountered Focke-Wulfs over Holland. Major Dave Schilling led the mission, but his radio failed before they reached the Dutch coast. Without communications, coordination collapsed. The German pilots recognized their advantage immediately. They attacked in pairs and sections, using their superior turning ability to split up the American formation and isolate individual P-47s. The Thunderbolts tried to turn with them. It was exactly what the Germans wanted. 5 P-47s were shot down that day. 4 pilots were killed, 1 captured. The 56th managed to claim only 2 German fighters destroyed. Zemke met Schilling when he landed and got the full report. Radio failure had robbed them of coordination, but the fundamental problem went deeper than communications equipment. The pilots were trying to fight the Germans on the Germans' terms, and those terms favored the lighter, more maneuverable Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Traditional fighter doctrine emphasized turning combat, the scissoring duels where pilots tried to get inside each other's turn radius and bring guns to bear. But the P-47 would lose that fight every single time. May brought more missions and more losses. The 56th escorted bombers to targets across occupied Europe, and every mission ended with some variation of the same frustrating reality. German fighters would approach the bomber stream, the P-47s would engage, the Germans would turn hard, and the Thunderbolts would wallow through their turns while the enemy fighters pulled away and repositioned. Sometimes the Americans got lucky. Sometimes they caught a German pilot making a mistake or caught one separated from his formation. But luck wasn't a tactic, and mistakes weren't reliable. June escalated the violence. On June 26th came the engagement that crystallized everything wrong with trying to use the P-47 as a traditional fighter. The 56th encountered Jagdgeschwader 26 over France, one of the most experienced fighter units in the Luftwaffe. These pilots had been flying combat operations since 1940. They had fought in the Battle of Britain, over the Soviet Union, in North Africa. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to exploit an opponent's weaknesses. They methodically tore apart the 56th's formation. The German pilots would attack, draw the P-47s into turning fights, then break away and re-engage from different angles. They used the vertical dimension expertly, climbing and diving to maintain energy advantage. The Americans tried to counter, tried to use their altitude, tried to maintain formation discipline. But they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, trying to execute tactics designed for different aircraft against opponents who understood exactly how to beat them. Captain Robert Johnson's aircraft became a testament to the P-47's incredible toughness that day. German cannon fire ripped through his fighter, shredding control surfaces, puncturing fuel tanks, tearing holes in the wings and fuselage. Over 200 hits registered on the post-flight inspection. The engine kept running despite multiple impacts. The wing didn't fold, despite catastrophic damage to internal structures. Johnson made it back to England and landed successfully. The aircraft's durability was extraordinary, but durability wasn't enough. An aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment and still fly home was valuable. An aircraft that could prevent the enemy from inflicting that punishment in the first place was better. The P-47 was surviving fights, but not winning them. 8th Air Force bomber losses continued to climb. German fighters broke through the escorts regularly. The strategic bombing campaign was failing, and the P-47 was failing with it. By July 1943, the 56th had been in combat for 3 months and had destroyed 9 German aircraft while losing 10 of their own. That ratio was unsustainable. At that rate, the group would be wiped out long before they made any significant impact on the Luftwaffe. Something fundamental had to change. The aircraft wasn't going to change. The laws of physics weren't going to change. That meant the tactics had to change, and Hubert Zemke was the man who would change them. The tactician's revelation. Hubert Zemke wasn't a typical fighter pilot in any conventional sense. Born to German immigrant parents in Montana in 1914, he had grown up during the Depression, tough and practical-minded. His father worked as a bailiff, managing land for wealthy families, instilling in young Hub a respect for discipline and systematic thinking. He had boxed in college, a sport that taught him valuable lessons about patience, about studying an opponent, about finding weaknesses and exploiting them methodically. Boxing wasn't about wild aggression. It was about footwork, positioning, timing. It was about making your opponent fight your fight rather than allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. When he entered Army flight training in 1936, he brought that analytical mindset to aviation. The timing was fortuitous. The Army Air Corps was expanding, preparing for a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. Young pilots with aptitude and intelligence were given opportunities that wouldn't have existed in peacetime. Zemke excelled in training, demonstrating both natural flying ability and the kind of analytical thinking that marked superior officers. He graduated and was assigned to operational units, flying the fighters available in the late 1930s, learning the fundamentals of aerial combat as they were understood at that time. By the time war came to America, Zemke had accumulated experience that few other pilots could match. He had spent time in England in 1940 as an observer, watching the RAF and Luftwaffe fight the Battle of Britain. He saw Spitfires and Hurricanes defending British cities against German bombers and their fighter escorts. He watched both sides develop and refine their tactics in real combat conditions. The British taught him about radar-directed intercepts and sector control. The Germans, through observation of their tactics, demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated fighter attacks and aggressive prosecution of targets. He had gone to the Soviet Union in 1941, training Russian pilots to fly the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk. He saw how different nations approached the same problems with different solutions based on their industrial capabilities, strategic situations, and cultural factors. He had seen different air forces, different tactics, different approaches to aerial combat. When he returned to the United States in 1942, he was assigned to test the new P-47 Thunderbolt. For months, he flew the aircraft, exploring its capabilities and limitations, pushing it to its operational limits, learning what it could and couldn't do. What Zemke discovered during those test flights was that the P-47 had characteristics that made no sense in traditional fighter doctrine, but opened possibilities for something entirely new. Yes, it couldn't turn. Yes, it climbed slowly. Yes, it accelerated like a freight train from low speeds. But in a dive, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine and heavy airframe became advantages rather than liabilities. The thick wing remained stable as airspeed increased past 400 miles per hour. The engine kept producing power, even as thin air at high altitude starved other aircraft. The robust structure handled the increasing air pressure and gravitational forces that accompanied high-speed dives. Traditional fighter tactics assumed that altitude was valuable primarily as a defensive position, a place to spot enemy aircraft from above and maintain visual awareness. But Zemke began to conceptualize altitude differently. Altitude was potential energy. Every 1,000 feet of height represented speed waiting to be released. A fighter at 30,000 feet wasn't just higher than a fighter at 20,000 feet. It possessed 10,000 feet of potential energy that could be converted into kinetic energy through a dive. That energy translated into speed. And speed, Zemke realized, was the ultimate advantage. The Focke-Wulf 190 was faster than the P-47 in level flight at most altitudes. It turned better. It climbed faster, but it couldn't dive faster. When a P-47 at 30,000 feet rolled into a steep dive, accelerating toward terminal velocity, nothing in the Luftwaffe's inventory could keep up. The FW-190 was lighter, and that lightness became a liability in the dive. Lighter aircraft reached their structural limits sooner. Their controls stiffened more severely at high speeds. Their engines lost power as airspeed increased and the propeller efficiency dropped. The P-47's massive weight, thick wing, and powerful engine turned all those problems into advantages. Zemke started developing tactics around this fundamental insight. Stop trying to turn with German fighters. Never commit to horizontal maneuvering. Instead, position at altitude. Wait for the Germans to commit to an attack on the bombers, then dive through them at speeds they couldn't match. Hit hard, dive through, and use the remaining speed to zoom back to altitude. Never get slow. Never turn with the enemy. Think in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Use altitude like currency, spending it for speed when needed, then climbing back up to replenish it. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but required complete rethinking of fighter doctrine. It meant giving up the romantic notion of swirling dogfights. It meant accepting that the P-47 would never be a traditional fighter. But it also meant using the aircraft's actual strengths rather than lamenting its weaknesses. Through the summer of 1943, Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly in these new tactics. They practiced diving attacks on ground targets. They worked on high-speed gunnery passes. They studied energy management, learning to judge speeds and angles by feel, understanding when they had enough energy to climb back to safety and when they needed to disengage and run for home. The 56th Fighter Group became a laboratory for a new kind of aerial warfare. Some pilots grasped the concepts immediately. Others struggled to abandon everything they had learned about fighter combat. Zemke was patient but firm. He explained the mathematics repeatedly. He showed them gun camera footage demonstrating how German fighters couldn't follow a P-47 through a high-speed dive. He brought in pilots who had successfully used the tactics to share their experiences. Slowly, systematically, he built a group of pilots who understood that they weren't flying traditional fighters. They were flying high-speed attack aircraft that used altitude and diving speed as their primary weapons. By September 1943, the 56th was ready. They had developed the doctrine. They had practiced the execution. They understood the mathematics of energy and speed. Now, they needed to prove the concept in combat. October 1943 would provide that proof in ways that shocked the Luftwaffe and transformed the air war over Europe. October 4th. The proof of concept. The mission, briefing on the morning of October 4th, included one detail that changed everything. The bomber stream would fly at 22,000 feet. Zemke positioned his Thunderbolts at 30,000 feet, giving them 8,000 feet of altitude advantage, 8,000 feet of potential energy waiting to be converted into diving speed. That altitude advantage represented the difference between theory and practice, between doctrine written on paper and tactics proven in combat. 52 P-47s climbed into the cold morning air over England and formed up for the escort mission. German radar stations tracked them as they crossed the Dutch coast at 9:30 in the morning. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 26 to intercept. 73 Focke-Wulf 190s climbed toward the American bomber formation. The German pilots expected what they always saw when engaging American escorts. They expected P-47s flying tight formation alongside the bombers, constrained by the need to stay with the heavies, easy targets when forced to maneuver slowly. But the 56th Fighter Group wasn't escorting the bombers in any traditional sense. They were hunting German fighters from 8,000 feet above them. At 9:52, Zemke spotted the German formation assembling 15 miles ahead of the bombers at 18,000 feet. The Focke-Wulfs were climbing into their standard attack position, following doctrine that had worked successfully for years. Gain altitude advantage over the bombers. Dive through the formation at high speed. Use that speed to escape before the escorts could react. It was textbook Luftwaffe intercept tactics. But this morning, those tactics would meet something the Germans had never encountered before. Zemke rolled his P-47 into a 70-degree dive. 51 Thunderbolts followed him down, 7 tons of aircraft and ammunition accelerating toward terminal velocity. The massive propellers bit into the thin air at 30,000 feet. The double Wasp engines roared at full military power. The thick wings remained stable as airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour, past 350, past 400. The German fighters never looked up. They were focused on the bombers below them, preparing for their diving attack, positioning for the perfect approach angle. Then, Zemke's first burst of 50 caliber fire ripped through a Focke-Wulf's cockpit at 450 miles per hour closing speed. The German pilot never pulled out of his climb. He never had a chance to react. One moment he was preparing to attack American bombers. The next moment, 8 streams of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition tore through his fighter from above and behind at angles no defensive tactics could anticipate. What happened next lasted 90 seconds, but changed the air war over Europe. 51 more Thunderbolts dove through the German formation at speeds the Focke-Wulfs couldn't match. Each P-47 carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. The combined firepower of the entire group put 68,000 rounds into the sky every 60 seconds. German pilots tried to react. They tried to brake, tried to turn, tried to dive away, but the physics were all wrong. A Focke-Wulf at 400 miles per hour couldn't pull out of a dive as quickly as the heavier P-47. The Thunderbolt's thick wing and massive structure handled the G-forces better. German pilots blacked out trying to match the American turn rates, or their aircraft came apart under the stress. Zemke's wingman, Lieutenant Walter Cook, watched one Focke-Wulf try to dive away from his attack. The German pilot pushed his stick forward, diving vertically, trying to use speed to escape. Cook stayed with him. The P-47's weight advantage in a dive meant he was actually accelerating faster than the lighter German fighter. At 500 miles per hour, structural limits mattered more than agility. The Focke-Wulf's right wing folded backward and tore off. The wreckage tumbled toward the Dutch farmland below, pieces scattering across miles of countryside. The remaining Thunderbolts didn't dogfight. They didn't try to turn with the Germans. Each pilot executed the tactics exactly as trained. Make one high-speed pass, fire, dive through, use the remaining speed to climb back to altitude. Zemke had calculated this precisely. The P-47's engine produced enough power to regain 8,000 feet in 4 minutes. 4 minutes to climb back to hunting altitude. Then they could dive again. The Germans had no counter for this tactic. They couldn't climb fast enough to escape the diving Thunderbolts. They couldn't dive fast enough to outrun them. They couldn't turn because the P-47s never committed to turning fights. By 10:03, 11 minutes after Zemke's first attack, the sky above the bomber stream was empty of German fighters. The Focke-Wulfs that survived fled east toward their airfields, scattered and disorganized. Not one German fighter made it through to attack the bombers. 0 bombers lost to fighters that morning. The 56th Fighter Group reformed at altitude and continued the escort mission. The bombers hit their targets without interference. The return flight showed more Luftwaffe formations in the distance, but none approached close enough to engage. The German fighters had learned something terrifying that morning. The American escorts weren't just protecting bombers anymore. They were actively hunting Luftwaffe fighters, and they were using tactics that made traditional defensive measures meaningless. The 56th landed at Halesworth between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. Ground crews counted ammunition expenditure. Gun cameras were pulled for film development. Intelligence officers began debriefing pilots. The initial reports seemed almost impossible to believe. The group claimed 21 confirmed German fighters destroyed. Another 8 probably destroyed. 16 damaged. 0 American aircraft lost. 0 pilots wounded. It was the most lopsided victory any American fighter group had achieved to that point in the war. 8th Air Force Headquarters demanded verification. They sent investigators to interview every pilot separately. They analyzed all gun camera footage. They cross-referenced with radar tracks and radio intercepts from both sides. Every claim checked out. October 4th, 1943, had been real. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft everyone said couldn't win dogfights, had just destroyed or damaged 45 German fighters without losing a single pilot. The tactics worked. The mathematics were sound. Now the question became whether this was a fluke or whether Zemke had discovered something that could be repeated consistently. The October rampage continues. 3 weeks would answer that question definitively. 8th Air Force scheduled maximum effort bomber missions every day, weather permitted. Bremen, Münster, Wilhelmshaven, Emden, industrial targets deep in Germany. Each mission drew massive Luftwaffe response. The Germans couldn't allow American bombers to systematically destroy their war production. They had to defend, which meant sending up fighters, which meant giving the 56th Fighter Group targets. October 8th brought an escort mission to Bremen. The group intercepted 40 Messerschmitt 109s, forming up to attack the bomber stream. Same tactics, high-altitude position, diving attacks, single passes, zoom climb recovery. 6 German fighters destroyed, 0 American losses. The mathematics worked again. The German pilots were brave, skilled, experienced. But bravery and skill couldn't overcome the fundamental physics of energy and speed. October 10th saw the Münster raid. 60 Focke-Wulfs attempted to break through to the bombers. Zemke's pilots hit them in 3 successive diving passes, each group diving, firing, and climbing back to altitude while the next group dove through. 9 confirmed kills, 2 probables. The bombers completed their mission without losing a single aircraft to fighter attack. Flak accounted for 2 B-17s, but German fighters never reached firing range. The pattern repeated through mid-October. The Luftwaffe kept sending fighters to defend their industrial targets. The 56th Fighter Group kept diving through them from altitude. German pilots started recognizing the threat. Luftwaffe intelligence began tracking American fighter tactics and identified the new danger. They called it the Amerikanische Taktik, the American diving tactic. They tried to develop counters. They sent formations in at different altitudes, hoping to force the American escorts to split their attention. They attempted to approach from the flanks rather than head-on. Nothing worked. Zemke positioned his squadrons in vertical layers. One squadron at 30,000 feet, second at 28,000, third at 26,000. When Germans came high, the top squadron dove. When Germans came low, the bottom squadron dove. The middle squadron covered both. Every P-47 maintained enough altitude advantage to accelerate into attack speed. The German fighters couldn't escape the geometry. They couldn't climb high enough. They couldn't dive fast enough. They couldn't turn because the Thunderbolts refused to turn with them. The death of Wilhelm Galland, October 20th, brought a mission that would demonstrate the effectiveness of Zemke's tactics against the most experienced pilots the Luftwaffe could field. The target was the railway yards at Düren. Intelligence reported that Jagdgeschwader 26 and elements of Jagdgeschwader 3 would defend. These were elite units, commanded by some of the most skilled pilots in the German Air Force. Leading the German interceptors that day was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland. The younger brother of Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, Wilhelm had proven himself in his own right. 55 confirmed victories, 7 years of combat experience. He had fought in Spain during the Civil War, over Poland in 1939, France in 1940, and continuously over the Western Front since 1941. He commanded the 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26, widely regarded as one of the finest fighter units in the world. If anyone could counter the American diving tactics, it would be pilots like Wilhelm Galland. The 56th Fighter Group took off from Halesworth at 8:30 that morning. Zemke flew in command, positioning his 52 Thunderbolts at 32,000 feet, giving them 10,000 feet of altitude advantage over the expected German interceptors. 73 German fighters rose to meet the bombers. Zemke counted the contacts at 9:58. Jagdgeschwader 26 and parts of Jagdgeschwader 3, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Wilhelm Galland positioned his formation for a classic bounce attack on the bombers. He held altitude advantage over the B-17s. His pilots were in perfect formation, executing textbook Luftwaffe doctrine. They began their diving attack at 10:45, diving toward the bomber stream from above and behind, planning to make one high-speed pass through the formation, and then use their speed to climb away before the escorts could react. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before, but the circumstances had changed in ways the Germans didn't fully appreciate. Zemke was already diving. His 52 Thunderbolts had 2,000 feet more altitude than Galland's formation. They hit the German fighters from above and behind at 470 miles per hour. The initial pass destroyed 6 fighters in 11 seconds. The German formation scattered. Galland's wingmen followed him through, but the coordinated attack they had planned dissolved into chaos. 3 more Focke-Wulfs went down. The sky above Düren became a 3-dimensional battlefield. P-47s diving from altitude. German fighters trying to climb to the bombers. Both forces colliding at 25,000 feet. 50 caliber tracers and 20mm cannon fire crisscrossed the airspace. Aircraft debris fell toward the city below. Zemke destroyed a Focke-Wulf over the Dummer Lake area, his 2nd kill that day. His wingman shot down a Messerschmitt 109. The combat moved west as German fighters tried to regroup and make another attack run. The P-47 stayed with them, executing diving attacks, zoom climbs, never committing to turning engagements. Wilhelm Galland's Focke-Wulf took multiple 50 caliber hits in the engine and cockpit. The fighter went into an uncontrolled spin at 23,000 feet. Galland had no chance to recover. His aircraft impacted the ground near Liège at terminal velocity, burying itself and its pilot 12 feet into Belgian farmland. The impact created a crater that measured over 20 feet across. When recovery crews found the wreckage 2 months later, they could barely identify the aircraft type. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and skilled fighter leaders, died in a battle that lasted less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. By 10:52, the combat was over. 17 German fighters had been destroyed in that 7-minute window. Galland's death represented something more significant than the loss of one pilot, regardless of his skill or experience. It demonstrated that the American tactics worked against the absolute best pilots the Luftwaffe could field. Traditional doctrine, perfect execution, and years of combat experience meant nothing when the fundamental tactical framework was obsolete. The Americans had changed the rules of engagement, and the Germans had no immediate answer. The Luftwaffe noticed. Intelligence reports began reaching higher command levels. American fighter groups were operating differently. They were positioning at extreme altitudes. They were using diving attacks that German fighters couldn't counter. They were refusing to engage in traditional turning combat. And most importantly, they were winning. The kill ratios were shifting dramatically in favor of the Americans. Something fundamental had changed in the air war over Europe. The month that changed everything. By October 31st, the 56th Fighter Group had flown 9 major combat missions in 1 month. The statistical summary was stunning. 39 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. Multiple probables and damaged aircraft beyond that. 1 American pilot lost during the entire month. The group that supposedly couldn't dogfight had become the highest-scoring fighter group in 8th Air Force. The Germans noticed and reacted. Luftwaffe intelligence compiled reports on American fighter tactics and distributed them to fighter commanders across the Western Front. They identified the threat specifically. American fighters were no longer flying close escort alongside bombers. They were positioning thousands of feet above the bomber streams and hunting German interceptors before they could reach attack positions. They were using altitude advantage to generate diving speeds that made interception impossible. They were refusing to engage in traditional combat, instead executing hit-and-run attacks that exploited the P-47's strengths while avoiding situations where its weaknesses mattered. Jagdgeschwader commanders held emergency conferences. How do you fight an enemy who won't turn with you? How do you intercept bombers when the escorts dive on you from altitude you can't reach before you're in position to attack? How do you train pilots to counter tactics that negate everything fighter doctrine emphasized? The Luftwaffe had no good answers. They tried various approaches. They sent fighters in at multiple altitudes simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the American escorts. They tried approaching from different vectors to avoid the diving attacks. They attempted to draw the escorts away from the bombers through feints and diversionary attacks. Nothing worked consistently. Zemke adapted faster than the Germans could counter. He positioned his squadrons in vertical layers to cover multiple altitudes. He stationed sections ahead of the bomber stream to intercept German formations before they even reached attack positions. He trained his pilots to recognize German tactical changes and respond appropriately. The 56th success rate remained extraordinarily high through November and December. Other P-47 groups flying in 8th Air Force weren't achieving the same results. The 4th Fighter Group, the 78th Fighter Group, the 352nd. These were competent units with skilled pilots. But they weren't getting the kill ratios the 56th achieved. The difference was doctrine. Other groups were still trying to use the P-47 as a traditional fighter. They were still getting drawn into turning fights. They were still trying to stay close to the bombers rather than hunting freely at altitude. The aircraft wasn't the limiting factor. The tactics were. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker recognized this and took action. In December 1943, he ordered Zemke to brief all P-47 group commanders on his tactics. On December 8th, every fighter group commander in 8th Air Force attended a conference at Kings Cliff Airfield. Zemke spent 4 hours explaining the mathematics. The P-47 couldn't turn. Accept that. Don't try to dogfight. Use altitude. Convert height to speed. Hit fast. Disengage fast. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never get slow. Never turn with the enemy. Think vertically, not horizontally. Some commanders grasped the concepts immediately and began implementing them Others resisted. They had trained their pilots in traditional dogfighting techniques. They had built their doctrine around turning combat and close-in maneuvering. Zemke was telling them everything they knew was wrong for the Thunderbolt, that the aircraft couldn't do what fighter doctrine required. So they needed to change the doctrine rather than expecting the aircraft to change. Colonel Don Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group, was scheduled to transition to P-51 Mustangs in January 1944. He asked Zemke whether the diving tactics would work for Mustangs too. Zemke's answer was instructive. Yes, every fighter benefited from altitude advantage and high-speed attacks, but the P-47 needed those tactics to survive. The Mustang had options. The Thunderbolt didn't. That was the fundamental difference. The P-47's weaknesses forced American pilots to innovate. Those innovations created tactics that proved superior even for fighters that didn't need them. The strategic impact. The 56th Fighter Group's October 1943 performance had ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate kill totals. The strategic bombing campaign had been failing through the summer and early fall of 1943. German fighter defenses were inflicting unsustainable losses on American bomber formations. Missions to Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and other deep targets resulted in loss rates approaching 20%. At that rate, bomber crews had virtually no chance of completing their required 25 mission tours. The entire concept of daylight precision bombing was on the verge of collapse. The P-47's transformation changed that equation. When American fighters started destroying German interceptors before they reached the bomber streams, bomber losses dropped precipitously. Missions that would have cost dozens of bombers in August now resulted in minimal losses by December. The Germans still had flak, and flak remained deadly throughout the war. But fighter attacks, which had been the primary threat to bomber formations, became manageable. Bomber crews started believing they might actually survive their tours. Morale improved. The strategic bombing campaign continued. The Luftwaffe's fighter force began suffering unsustainable attrition. Germany was training new pilots, but the training programs couldn't replace combat losses quickly enough. More critically, experienced pilots, the cadre of veterans who formed the backbone of fighter units, were dying at rates the Luftwaffe couldn't afford. The loss of pilots like Wilhelm Galland represented more than numbers. It represented lost institutional knowledge, lost experience, lost leadership. Young replacement pilots arriving at fighter units found fewer experienced pilots to learn from. The quality of German fighter operations degraded steadily through late 1943 and into 1944. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had fundamentally shifted. American fighters dominated the skies. The P-47 played a central role in that shift. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as a flying tank had proven that survivability, firepower, and tactical innovation could overcome pure agility. The Thunderbolt's thick armor meant more pilots survived getting shot. The .850 caliber machine guns meant kills came easier, and the diving tactics meant the fights happened on American terms rather than German terms. The 56th Fighter Group flew its last combat mission on April 21, 1945. When the Air Force Historical Research Agency compiled final statistics, the numbers told a remarkable story. 447 missions flown, 19,391 sorties, 64,302 hours of combat flight time, 665.5 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. That was the highest aerial victory total of any fighter group in 8th Air Force, more than 100 victories ahead of the second-place group. And the 56th was the only fighter group in the European theater that flew the same aircraft type from first mission to last mission. The P-47 Thunderbolt that German pilots called too heavy for combat had destroyed more Luftwaffe fighters than any other American aircraft type. Not because the airframe changed, because the tactics changed. Zemke's diving attacks, his altitude discipline, his refusal to dogfight, his mathematical approach to aerial combat transformed the strategic bombing campaign, made D-Day possible, and won the air war over Europe. The legacy lives on. Hub Zemke transferred to the 479th Fighter Group in August 1944 to take command of a struggling P-38 unit that was converting to P-51 Mustangs. He scored additional victories with the 479th, bringing his total to 17 3/4 confirmed kills. On October 30th, 1944, he led a mission over Germany in deteriorating weather. Severe turbulence tore the wings off his P-51 at 18,000 feet. He bailed out and evaded capture for 3 days before German troops caught him. He spent the remainder of the war in Stalag Luft 1 as senior Allied officer, responsible for 9,000 prisoners. But the 56th Fighter Group didn't need Zemke anymore. His tactics had become doctrine. Every pilot in the group understood the mathematics. Every new replacement learned the system. The unit continued performing at elite levels under David Schilling's command through the final 7 months of the war. The group produced 39 fighter aces, more than any other 8th Air Force fighter group. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski scored 28 victories with the 56th, the highest total of any American pilot in the European theater. Captain Robert Johnson finished with 27. Colonel David Schilling claimed 22.5. These weren't lucky pilots. They were disciplined tacticians who understood physics, knew their aircraft's capabilities, refused to fight the enemy's fight, and made the Luftwaffe fight their fight instead. By April 1945, other P-47 groups across 8th Air Force had adopted variations of Zemke's tactics. Combined, P-47 Thunderbolt groups destroyed over 2,000 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The supposedly obsolete fighter became the most successful American aircraft in the European theater, measured by enemy fighters destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded because fighters like the P-47 made it succeed. Bomber losses declined from 20% per mission in 1943 to less than 2% by 1945. German industrial production collapsed. Ball bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, tank factories, all destroyed by bombers protected by escorts that finally worked. The lessons from the P-47's development and operational use extended far beyond World War II. Fighter tactics in the jet age incorporated energy management principles derived directly from Zemke's doctrine. Vietnam-era F-4 Phantom pilots used boom and zoom tactics that would have been instantly recognizable to P-47 pilots from 1943. The concepts remained valid, even as aircraft speeds doubled and tripled. Height advantage, speed advantage. Never commit to fights that favor the enemy. Use your strengths. Avoid situations where your weaknesses matter. These principles transcended specific aircraft and specific eras. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt demonstrates something essential about innovation and adaptation. The aircraft itself never changed fundamentally. It remained heavy, it remained sluggish in turns, it remained everything critics said it was. But someone recognized that those characteristics could be strengths in the right tactical framework. Someone stopped trying to make the P-47 into something it wasn't and started exploring what it actually could do. That shift in perspective, that willingness to question conventional wisdom and develop new approaches, made all the difference. October 1943 proved that innovation matters more than tradition, that thinking differently can overcome apparent disadvantages, that the side willing to adapt and evolve will defeat the side locked into established doctrine. The German pilots who laughed at the useless P-47 learned that lesson the hard way, watching from the ground as Zemke's Wolfpack destroyed 39 of their fighters in 1 month and fundamentally changed the air war over Europe. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. Every like helps us share these forgotten histories with more people who appreciate the real stories of innovation, courage, and tactical genius that shaped our world. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the battles and people who changed history. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community spans the globe, united by a shared passion for understanding how people overcame impossible odds through intelligence, discipline, and innovative thinking. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these memories alive.